pessoalmente. Good morning. Wow, that was loud. Thank you very much. Sorry about that, but it woke you up, right? What I was trying to say without shouting was good morning. I know we're delayed, we're behind time, and we apologize for that, but the proceedings will begin very, very soon. So I want to ask everybody, particularly on, it seems, the left side of the room from where I'm standing, to find a seat whilst you can, because once the dignitaries enter the room, I want to get started immediately. I think we all want to get started, right? So please, people milling around, take a seat, and we're minutes away. Thank you. gentlemen, again, good morning. If you could now take your seats, please, and turn your attention to the screens around you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I know I asked you to take your seats, but if you could indulge us to please rise for a moment for the Afreximbank anthem, ladies and gentlemen. Please rise from your seats for the Afreximbank anthem. over for the 3 days of these events. Now we have simultaneous interpretation in several languages, and so grab a headset if you haven't got one already. On channel 1 is English, channel 2 French, channel 3 is Portuguese, channel 4 is Swahili, and 5 is Arabic. Now, the overarching theme of the 29th Afreximbank annual meetings is realizing the AFCFTA potential in the post-COVID-19 era, leveraging the power of youth. So we thought it would be appropriate to introduce you to one of these youth. He's 29 years old. He's a social entrepreneur. He runs his own record label. He's a businessman. He's a UNESCO Peace Ambassador. But most of all, passionately, he's a poet. Please put your hands together for Mac Alunge.
Saisis l'esprit de la terre et reste debout. Nous ne sommes que les doigts d'une seule main. L'Afrique, notre patrie, notre marque multiculturelle. On dirait que Dieu visite partout ailleurs, mais il vit en Afrique. Ici où le ciel embrasse la terre, les étoiles se rassemblent à tes côtés et le créatif t'amène en balade. But who called us third world? Who lost us into those words? Who created the chords? Who played the record till we all believed in one accord? Who called us black? Who made black mean lack? Who led us off our own tracks that we cracked, quenched as sparks and fell on our backs? Who took the godness of blackness out of black? Well, we did. We did when we forgot our history in a hurry and borrowed our own story. When we forgot our glory and majesty and allowed ourselves be branded with imagery of tragedy, misery, and disharmony. When we let catastrophe become our only, our defining story. But if we scroll through the gallery of our history, as passed down through memory of our ancestry, if we gain that mastery and become our own jury, then maybe we will see the untold story of our untracked victory, the current invisibility of our bravery, the unappreciation of our imponderable dignity, the reality of our untraced yet unmatched glory. Our history is our future. African problems crave African solutions. Our creativity can never be used up because the more we use, the more there is. But young African, distracted by what is so far away, you do not see your own nose. The grass is greenest in our own yards. We are only as blind as we choose to be. But I hear thunder. Rain is on its way. So let our growth and comfort not coexist. For it's time for Africa. Prosperity is our birthright, our culture, our copyright, our children, our first light. They will shine through our midnight. Our visions, our touchlight, our insights, our lamplight. For a developed Africa so bright with peace without a gunfight. No fright, no flight. We all will stand up right. We'll rise and fight every giant till poverty and hunger are both out. Child labor will eradicate. Illiteracy will terminate. More jobs will create and more systems will innovate. It is our responsibility to rewrite our history, to take back our glory and tell our own story. Not the story of hunger and poverty, but of harmony and glory. Roles have changed, for change is the rule. The little black girl has no more fear of tigers. The beardless boy will teach aged men. So let education result in tolerance. I can see the edge of tomorrow. That is why we face neither east nor west. We face forward. Our children should learn of heroes of the past. while we make ourselves architects of the future. Let ambition never, ever end, for Africa is the future. Thank you.
Mac Alunge from Cameroon, the poet, ladies and gentlemen. Wow. If I had hair, it would be standing up right now. That was something else. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to acknowledge our host who will be seeing tomorrow, His Excellency Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt. We're also graced by the presence of the former President of Nigeria, His Excellency Dr. Olusegun Obasanjo. That's worthy of a round of applause. We're graced by the presence of the Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt, His Excellency Mr. Tarek Hassan Amer, as well as His Excellency Mr. Wamkele Mene, who's the Secretary General of the AFCFTA Secretariat. Also with us, another true champion of the AFCFTA, His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, the African Union Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals. You're very welcome. Now, I stand here lucky, actually, I suppose, to have too many ministers and governors from across the continent for me to mention. They've traveled from far and wide, and you're all warmly welcomed. The United Nations is ably represented too in the guise of Dr. Vera Songwe, Executive Director of UNECA, and Dr. Rebecca Greenspan, Secretary General of UNCTAD. This meeting also boasts some of the titans of African industry, such as Tony Elumelu, Alhaji Aliko Dangote, Monica Musonda, and so many shining stars of the digital and creative industries. Now, to our partners, the Afreximbank colleagues, international media, friends, family, welcome to the 29th Afreximbank annual meetings. You're very welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we have 3 days of plenary sessions and many tea breaks and lunches for you to network, meet old friends, and make new ones. I must say that you look better in this room than you do in my Zoom. I must say that. Now, we need to take advantage also. If you haven't received this already, check digitally. This would have been sent to you. Some of the complimentary excursions. Now, Egyptians make the best hosts. You can visit the magnificent pyramids or take a cruise down the Nile. All this culminates in a gala dinner on Friday evening. And what's even more interesting is the program for these meetings. Great speakers and great topics. The overall theme, as I said, is realizing the AFCFTA potential in the post-COVID-19 era, leveraging the power of Africa's youth. It's an important one because Africa's young people must not only benefit from things like the African Continental Free Trade Area, they must drive it. They already are the drivers of the African economies of the future, whether it's Lagos or Lusaka, Kigali, or here in Cairo. Young people are at the cutting edge of technological advancements. We also have a second theme for each day, and today, the second theme, or the sub-theme, I suppose, is AFCFTA as an instrument for Africa's economic transformation in a changing world. Now, from global pandemics to geopolitical upheaval, we'll be drilling down on how the continent can harness the power of the AFCFTA to position for success through all this changing world and all through all this crisis. Now, when it comes to the AFCFTA, it's hard for me to think of any financial institution, indeed, I dare say institution, that has been more significant to its evolution, or indeed to intra-Africa trade and trade finance than Afreximbank. So it gives me great pleasure at this point to invite to give the opening statement a man who I actually saw receive the African Banker of the Year Award 2022. Now, if that doesn't deserve a lusty round of applause, I don't know what does this morning, in Accra recently. We clapped a lot there too. We clapped a lot there. So I'm going to ask you to clap a lot now as I welcome to the stage the president and the chairman of Afreximbank's board of directors, Professor Benedict Orama.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Our very dear friend and co-host, His Excellency Tarek Ahmed, Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt. His Excellency Actor Sambo, former Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Your Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, Ambassadors, heads of international organizations, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is with immense pleasure that Afreximbank welcomes you all to our first in-person annual meeting since the COVID-19 pandemic broke in early 2020. It has been an unprecedented past 2 years. So allow me to extend our condolences to all those who might have lost loved ones as a result of the pandemic. As we begin the event associated with the 29th annual meetings of Afreximbank, I would like to extend our deepest appreciation to His Excellency Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, under whose auspices these events are holding. Special thanks to our friend Tarek, the Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt, as well as his able deputies and entire management and staff of Central Bank of Egypt for being magnificent, efficient, and committed co-hosts of these events. The Egyptian government, through the Central Bank of Egypt, are strong supporters of Afreximbank and committed to making it a strong and impactful continental institution. They have led the way whenever it mattered, contributing significant equity, giving the Afreximbank Central Bank Deposit Program the impetus it needed when they and the Central Bank of Nigeria became the initial depositors of billions of dollars under the scheme. The effect is that something that started tentatively, now has 50 participants. And through it, we have been able to mobilize $35 billion. The Central Bank of Egypt has also partnered with Afreximbank to train several African bankers in many areas. So for many of you central bankers here from different parts of Africa and commercial banks, I'm sure some of your colleagues or your staff must have benefited from those joint initiatives. We are also pleased to have been their choice to advise on the creation of a national export credit agency. As a result, Afreximbank has now been mandated to do the same in other countries, helping to create the financial architecture that will support trade under the AFCFTA. Ours is a partnership we highly value, and we thank the management and staff of CBE for standing strong behind what they own. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in March this year, The Economist of London published an article titled Africa's Ambitious Trade Plan Needs to Speed Up. In that article, it wrote, and I quote, in 1963, as decolonization swept through Africa, politicians heady with Pan-African ideals called for a common continental market. They saw it as a way to transcend colonial economic models based upon extracting and exporting natural resources. Sadly, there has been all too little progress since intra-African trade remains small compared with the continent's external trade. Primary commodities account for more than 70% of Africa's exports. Just 18% of exports to African economies are to others on the continent. African countries, although the AFCFTA has in theory been operational since the beginning of the year, in practice, no trade has happened under its terms because of continued political wrangling. Africa's leaders risk squandering the promise of freer trade, unquote. While The Economist was right as regards the facts set out in their article, the conclusions are wrong because the facts in the article are symptoms of a major problem the article did not explore. We cannot reverse the symptoms without confronting the problem. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the source of the problem can be found in the writings of a colonial administrator, Mr. Abbas Sarau, in 1920. He wrote, and I quote, economically a colonial possession means to their home country simply a privileged market wherein it will draw the raw materials it needs, dumping its own manufacturers in return. Economic policy is reduced to rudimentary procedures of gathering crops and battering them. Moreover, by strictly imposing on the colonial dependency the exclusive consumption of its manufactured products, the metropolis prevents any efforts to use or manufacture local raw materials on the spot, and any contact with the rest of the world. The colony is forbidden to establish any industry to improve itself by economic progress, to rise above the stage of producing raw materials, or to do business with the neighboring countries for its own enrichment across the customs barriers erected by the metropolitan powers. At independence in the 1960s, African leaders understood the urgency of reverse engineering this strategy. That was why among the key resolutions they passed at the inaugural meeting of the Organization of African Unity in 1963 were a commitment to study the possibility of establishing a free trade area between the various African countries. The means for developing trade among African countries through the organization and participation in African trade fairs and exhibitions, and by granting of transport and transit facilities. And finally, the establishment of an African payment and clearing union. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, while the problem were identified decades ago, it is only now that Africa can boast of possessing a combination of factors that can resolve it. And these include a visionary leadership, the youth, and digital technology. Our leadership has done the courageous work of giving us the AFCFTA. A lot now hinges on our youth. It is for this reason that Afreximbank dedicated this year's annual meeting to the theme, realizing the AFCFTA potential in the post-COVID-19 era, leveraging the power of the youth. Your Excellencies, it's our view that the youth will be the catalytic force to the realization of the continental agenda. Indeed, the youth have always been the catalyst to economic transformation and at the base of every industrial revolution in advanced countries. It is no coincidence that at the height of each industrial revolution, youth constituted the largest proportion of the labor force and population. For instance, when the US and Canada ascended to the ranks of major industrial powers in 1900, their population under 45 were 83% and 82%, respectively. And the population between the ages of 15 and 45 years were 48 and 47% in the two countries. The youth were equally central to the Asian miracle. The same 82% of the population were youth at the time these economies became industrial powers. Your Excellencies, the good news is that Africa finds itself at the exact same spot as the US, Canada, and Asia in their at the respective stages of their industrialization. Today, 85% of the continent's population is under 45 years, and 45% are between 15 and 45 years old. This asset in our hand is perhaps the greatest resource the continent has. an asset much more valuable than all the oil and mineral resources under the ground. And the African youth are beginning to make significant contributions to economic transformation across the continent. For example, in Nigeria, Mr. Aliko Dangote, as a young man in the 1920s, began to build what has become a global multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that has pivoted him to become the wealthiest person in Africa today. It was a young Tony Elumelu who transformed an ailing commercial bank into an institutional, an African multinational financial institution today. Lily Alfonso, a Malawian fashion designer, has risen from a modest beginning to create an identifiable brand in the global fashion industry. Sarah Diouf, a Senegalese fashion designer, has successfully expanded her ready-to-made affordable African labor fashion brand to the US and UK markets. And many young Africans who are talented from all over Africa are making the waves across the world. Sprouting everywhere in a fragmented continent, the African youth are poised to make giant strides in a single continental market and could seamlessly become the drivers of Africa's integration and intra-African trade. Policies that give them intellectual property protection, ease the cost of doing business, as well as improve access to markets, will unleash the power of the youth on the continent. That is why Afreximbank is today intervening with instruments that are geared towards supporting the growth of small businesses and promoting their integration into national, regional, and continental value chains. Afreximbank has therefore launched the How to Export within the AFCFTA. Through this initiative, Afreximbank is partnering with the International Trade Center to train small businesses and young entrepreneurs in Africa to participate in the AFCFTA. And as the youth are technology savvy, and we believe it is technology that will bring down the borders. Afreximbank and the AFCFTA Secretariat have started to implement the digital AFCFTA called the African Trade Gateway. This will offer the opportunity for the youth to access African markets, access payment services, and access credit. We must also prioritize the continent's culture and creative industries as they hold a potent force for accelerating continental integration and are predominantly youth-based. At Afreximbank, we are promoting the industry through a dedicated $500 million funding that is currently being implemented. So, Your Excellencies, whether a youth-powered AFCFTA will trigger a continental economic expansion, or whether the next decade will become lost decades for Africa, will depend on how we creatively deploy the energies and talents of our youth to implement the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We are happy that a protocol on the youth will be negotiated under the AFCFTA. that will provide a digital that will provide a great opportunity to formalize the integration of the youth into the continent-wide agenda. As we deliberate on these topical issues during the next 3 days, we should aim to produce concrete policy recommendations that will help us step up the implementation of the trade agreement. I look forward to exciting and thought-provoking discussions. And thank you for your kind attention.
One more round of applause for His Excellency Professor Benedict Orama, President and Chairman of the Board of Directors for Afreximbank. Thank you, sir, for getting us off to a rousing start. Now, there was one person that I didn't mention, and very important person in this room, and I'm going to correct that now. He's a strong supporter of Afreximbank, a passionate Pan-African. He's a quiet force using his considerable influence to push forward the agenda of the AFCFTA, intra-Africa trade and development of this beloved continent. So I want you to give him a warm round of applause, please. And I'm going to really ask him to stand and acknowledge His Excellency, the former Vice President of Nigeria, Namadi Sambo, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I must mention a housekeeping rule. I noticed a few people lighting up cigarettes outside there. I know this is normal, but Afreximbank events are non-smoking events. So if you do want to smoke, could you please smoke outside? If you want to, the only thing you're allowed to light up is the room with your wonderful personality and conversation. Okay, thank you. Okay, on to the next item on what is a very exciting agenda for the day. Global pandemics, the Ukrainian crisis, challenges for food, energy, the global supply chain disruptions. We'll hear about all of these things today and solutions to move Africa forward in these choppy waters. Very choppy waters if you're a central bank, if you run a central bank across the world, not just here in Africa. You have to be nimble. You have to be fleet-footed. Egypt is lucky to have just that in our next speaker, who's, in his own words, leads with an approach that is proactive, not reactive. To give the welcome remarks, please put your hands together for His Excellency Tarek Hassan Amer, Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt.
Good morning. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. What a wonderful day. We can't express enough our privilege and honor in Egypt and in the Central Bank to host this distinguished gathering and appreciate and respect each individual's time that has been given to us under their busy schedules and challenging work agendas to come and join this program jointly with the Afreximbank. So thank you very much. We really are very much honored. I would like, of course, to welcome His Excellency Vice President Namadi Sambo. It's an honor to have you, sir, with us, with your long track record in finance and trade support. And we hope that this program is going to be enlightening and valuable, bringing out the best of the ideas and actions to be done in favor of our dear continent and dear communities. This event, the importance that it gets, and it reflects the conviction of the Egyptian government at very senior level that the African missions and affairs are at the highest top of the agenda, and therefore His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, has agreed to honor us with his presence and hold this conference under his auspice. And we are going to see His Excellency the President tomorrow attending with us here and listening to him discussing various matters of concern. I've been with the central bank this time for 7 years. I started almost 20 years ago, on and off, but over those past 7 years, we have seen a different momentum and drive in terms of our international foreign affairs policy. And Africa has taken from the leadership of the country a different direction. And frankly, personally, I felt very comfortable with that. I felt very happy with that. And at the central bank, we've been very much indulged and involved in the African conventions and events and with African institutions with all our heart. And I think we made a little of a difference. And every time we participate and meet our partners, we feel much more connected and belonging and wanting to do much more. And feel the pain of not achieving for our communities while we can see the potential there. And for years, we are always, and people questioning themselves, why aren't we achieving this potential? There have been efforts and strides, individual efforts and strides, a lot of work from leaders across the country in the economic field, in the finance field, in the banking field. And I really have been impressed by what Professor Benedict Orama has been doing. His presentation today actually was very stimulating to thinking a lot. But also it made me think about the business institutions and the finance institution and the banks understand the issues on the ground because they are in the market. And the market is actually, and the youth that have been demonstrated are ahead of us, are ahead of governments. The market is moving, and we need to understand who is going to take the ownership, what will be the vehicles and the framework that can bring the aspirations that were presented in terms of intra-African trade and fighting poverty and inflation into reality. And I say it is the economic and business institutions and the regional banks and the multilateral domestic banks. I believe that African solutions can only happen from within Africa. We have for years tried to find solutions outside Africa, but I think this was not the right thing. Our solutions can be found within us. And I am a man who's been used to get things done. And I would like to see things done. And I can see that. The ingredients are there and the solutions are within Africa. And what is lacking us? We needed to get closer together. And I thank institutions like Afreximbank, like African Development Bank, when they bring us together. Because this personal contact creates trust. And I think trust is something that we need to develop together. And I say to our Egyptian community and business people, smart trader is a trader that looks for a fair deal, that looks for a deal that works for both sides. But opportunistic uh, perspectives are very short-lived and does not work. And therefore, this trust is very important and will not develop except if we get together more on a personal basis. But of course, the challenge is that we are all drowning in our own problems and challenges. We have huge problems, especially at central banks. The challenges are very large and far-reaching. But I believe if we put this in mind, we can step by step get together. Afreximbank, I think, is a good stepping stone as a vehicle to work on achieving our African agenda for fighting poverty, creating jobs, and fighting inflation through improving intra-African trade. I always say, why is Egypt bringing meat from Brazil? Why is Egypt not bringing meat from the neighboring countries? And what President Orama has presented to us about some of the words of historical experts and politicians, we need to do something. We cannot stay unwatched. But the young people is the solution, because the young people, they have the energy and the drive. They are not reached a situation where they're comfortable in their positions. They're comfortable getting salaries and getting paid. They have ambitions and aspirations and are willing to take risks, and they have hopes and dreams. And in the central bank, we had this experience. We have hired a lot of young people over the last 15 years. And what they've done were miracles. They've carried over the whole economy. And you cannot believe how they are operating. Our belief in our young people is incredible. We have our young deputy governor here of the central bank. He took the position while he was 39 years old. That's a very, very senior position in the country, appointed by the president. I am very proud of him, and I'm very proud of the leadership, young leadership team at the central bank and his colleagues, because they make me feel hopeful for the future, and we cannot live without hope. So we have to push them, but we keep saying that and we don't do it. We have to push them, and we have to shake every historical norm and refreshen the blood in order to get our institution more agile, more quick, more effective. And I hope that your program in the coming few days will come up with important messages. What is important, and I tell my people, when you go into a gathering, come back with an idea or two, but make sure to get them done on the ground, because we need people who can convert ideas and aspirations into reality, not just talk, because talk is very easy. But very few people have the capability to convert ideas and aspirations into reality. And the banking sector people have this skill into concluding business transactions, into getting things done on the ground. I remember once we had a meeting with His Excellency the President 6 years ago, and we had the ex-Prime Minister, and he had some certain concerns about the performance of some people, and he told him, bring us bankers, bring us bankers. We have big challenges these days, but big challenges are for big people. And we learned that during challenges, we rise and we are strong. We face them and confront them and not run away from them. Our challenges is inflation against our people and community. We are concerned because we care about people and community. Our drive in the Central Bank of Egypt was, and our main concept in running our institution was the community. And you will find a lot of actions have been taken in this direction. And if you are connected to the community and looking for the aspirations of the community, you can never go wrong. If we believe that we know it all alone, it's not right. The market is the master, the market is the professor. Let's listen to our people and see what they need. And they know it all. So we are working hard to fight inflation that's coming even in the future. We are also fighting to balance that and keep growth levels so that jobs are protected. This is a very difficult formula to keep investing, but to put inflation under check. This is a very difficult formula. And this is what central banks today are struggling about. Some global central banks are being accused that they've acted late. We are happy that we still have inflation reasonably, considering the levels globally, under reasonable control. However, we keep thinking about the solutions for this unprecedented crisis in the world. And I hope that with institutions like Afreximbank, that the African communities will achieve their aspirations. We in the government of Egypt, I believe the government will never be hesitant to support this institution and the institutions alike with capital, with support. And like the president was telling me this morning, the Chinese similar bank is 100 times as large. And why don't we capitalize on a team of leadership that has the drive, that really are hungry to do more? This is an opportunity. The wind is blowing. Let's put the sail up. Let's support this institution with all what we can, because actually we want this bank to do much more. We want to see this bank in more African countries, and we in more markets, in more industries. I'm happy to see that they are trying. They have established companies I see in the PAPS, the FEDA, the Afri-Insure, the MANSA, the AMCE, the IATF, the AVAT NFCS, the AOAC. They are trying hard. These people are trying hard and believe in what they're doing. And I always say, without passion, you will not get unconventional results. We are willing to support them by putting more capital, by putting more resources. But I'm telling President Orama now I have a problem, because I've been appointed chairman of the African Development Bank for this year. So now there's gonna be competition. And I go there, I hear the name Afrexim, and I come here and I hear the name ADB. Competition is good, but I will keep the secrets, I promise you. I wish you good luck. It's people with conviction and belief are going to lead and going to receive the blessing of the great Lord. God bless you all.
He said, without passion, you won't get unconventional results. Please put your hands together for the passion of Tarek Hassan Amer, Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt. Wonderful, wonderful comments there. Now, another little bit of housekeeping from today to tomorrow. Antigen tests are available in the medical tent in this hotel, in this St. Regis. Also, in the 9 other major hotels where most of you are staying, you can also get antigen tests. And if you check your apps, you'll find out more information on that. Now, we're going to break from speeches for a second, because one thing you'll know about Afreximbank events is that it's not just about talk, it's about walk as well. We do a lot of deal signings and a lot of magic happens. So we're going to get that started now. We're going to do a signing between Arise IPP and Afreximbank. It's a framework agreement. It's a partnership MOU, you could call it that. But before we do, please turn your attention to the screens for a short video. Okay, I think that was the short video. I said it was short. Oh, there you go.
Afreximbank and Arise IIP are 2 institutions which have very aligned strategic objectives of promoting, facilitating, and supporting industrialization in Africa. We identify opportunities across the continent that enable the sustainable transformation of raw materials via agro-processing, light manufacturing, to unlock value and to create new industries. Afreximbank has been a partner to Arise IIP for over a decade now, with the bank financing the development of an oil palm processing mill in Gabon through a $300 million syndicated term facility. We also provided a total of $234 million for the construction of a container terminal and a mineral port to serve the Nkok SEZ. The bank in 2017 financed the development of the Gabon Special Economic Zone, which is focused on timber transformation. The JZS Park has been responsible for creating over 7,000 jobs, attracting foreign direct investments of about 1.45 billion euros. We believe this is indeed a success story, and we aim to replicate this across the continent in other member countries. The bank has collaborated with Arise to finance new industrial park projects, playing the role of mandated lead arranger in several transactions. For instance, we supported them in raising $102 million for the development of an industrial park in Benin Republic, and also the raising of $264 million for the development of a logistics park in Togo. We believe we can collaborate with Arise by extending the bank's suite of services and products to tenants in their industrial parks and special economic zones. Afreximbank and Arise will continue to deepen our collaboration in facilitating industrialization. We will be partnering to support the development of industrial parks in new countries such as Chad, the DRC, Rwanda, and we believe these collaborations will boost intra-Africa and extra-African trade.
Okay, there you have it. Let's get it done. So I'm going to now, you can see I have a table there and a couple of chairs. So I'm going to call the signatories to this partnership agreement between Arise IPP and Afreximbank. I will first call on the co-founder of Arise IPP, co-founder and CEO, Mr. Gagan Gupta. Gagan, are you here? I haven't actually seen you, but you're here somewhere. Gagan? There he is, Gagan. Ladies and gentlemen, Gagan Gupta, CEO and founder of Arise Integrated Industrial Platforms. And to sign on behalf of Afreximbank, back again to the stage, is Professor Benedicto Rama. Professor Benedicto Rama, President of Afreximbank, will be signing on behalf of Afreximbank. This is going to be a very, very fruitful partnership. We have the documents. Do you need a pen? No? You have a pen? Okay. Right, they have a pen. So gentlemen, you can go ahead and do the needful and sign. And as you're signing, I'll tell you a little bit of a background to this agreement. On the 18th of May 2022, a workshop was held between Afreximbank and Arise Integrated Industrial Platforms, Arise IPP, as it's normally called, to deepen the collaboration between both institutions on industrialization initiatives across the continent. The workshop was attended by executive management of the bank and Arise IPP and relevant departments from within the bank to discuss various collaborations and activities. Justification for the partnership, well, the two institutions have aligned strategic objectives of promoting, facilitating, and supporting industrialization in Africa. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, a partnership to last a lifetime. Congratulations. Thank you very much. Now I'll ask my ushers to please remove those chairs and table. That is one of many signings that we're going to be having. I can tell you about another one that's going to happen in the summit room outside. We're going to later sign a deal, the AEE Power Facility. That's going to be announced and signed. So anybody interested in seeing the AEE Power Facility deal signage, that's going to be in the summit room later. Okay, so moving on now, we're now moving on to the keynote address. The theme is reordering of global supply chains post-COVID-19 and the Ukraine crisis. And this explores the opportunities and threats to the AFCFTA. Now, to give the lecture, we're lucky to have a world authority on growth in developing countries and on the convergence between advanced and developing nations and economies. He is the Professor Emeritus at he's a senior fellow of the Hoover Institute. He's the Professor Emeritus at Stanford University. He's also a distinguished visiting fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. Now, in 2001, you'll be interested to know, our keynote speaker today received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work that assessed how markets try to close information gaps. He's published widely, and he's the author of several books and numerous articles and many papers, too many for me to mention here. So he's going to be joining us virtually from his home in Milan, Italy. So hopefully we can get a good connection. Please put your hands together for Professor Michael Spence. Professor, we can see you loud and clear. I know you had some internet challenges, but you came on regardless. Can you say a few words so we can hear you? Say hello.
So Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, leaders in government, business, and civil society organizations, it's a huge privilege for me to be with you today. I would have really liked to be back in Cairo and with you in person, but I couldn't. This internet connection, this almost never happens, but somebody out on the street cut my fiber internet connection. And I am now talking to you using a reasonably decent cell phone connection, and I hope it works. And anyway, it's inspiring to be with you, and it's inspiring to hear the words of the people who've spoken previously, and the level of optimism I think is truly extraordinary. I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about the environment we're operating in. It's pretty difficult, to put it mildly. So here we are. I'm going to talk about something that I've come to call regime change in the global economy. I think it's with us. It is a multidimensional phenomenon, and I think it calls on all of us to rethink many of the things that we have simply taken for granted. in the last few years. So my objective is to start by trying to make an assessment of the current very challenging environment that we're in, and then mainly to argue that we are experiencing these very fundamental multidimensional changes, including at least 3 or 4 huge transformations in the global economy. And if this is right, then I think it calls on all of us to try to rethink many of the things we've taken for granted. The way in which the global supply chains have been architected, the bases for comparative advantage, supply versus demand constrained growth, and the fading of deflationary pressures that we've experienced for more than probably 3 decades now, and much more. I would characterize these conditions as sort of radically complex and uncertain. And I think I don't know anybody who claims to be able to understand all of this, these forces and whatnot pushing against each other. So one has to approach this with a certain amount of humility. But I think the fundamental challenge facing people in business, facing people in the financial markets, facing central banks, is to, on the one hand, do a good job of navigating the extreme short-run turbulence that we're experiencing without losing sight of the longer-term objectives. And I think what you heard before I had an opportunity to speak with you is entirely consistent with that sort of, that pairwise kind of challenge. So let me focus for a moment on the pandemic and the recovery. So the great financial crisis produced an uptick in global sovereign debt levels as a fraction of GDP. And then they rose a little bit in the intervening period where we had what you could arguably be was a relatively weak global recovery. But then the pandemic struck, and this has produced a dramatic increase, not an inappropriate increase. This is the right way to respond to the pandemic, to try to protect businesses and people from the full force of the pandemic. But it has produced a significant rise in global sovereign debt levels, which means, especially in an inflationary and rising interest rate environment, there is more fragility, there is more risk, there is more likelihood of debt distress in various parts of the world. And these things are just a factor that we're going to have to deal with. In a different dimension, the pandemic produced a really significant acceleration in the rate of adoption of digital technologies. And the long run impact of that is going to be entirely beneficial. Because basically what it did is overcome, the kinds of inertia that characterize both individual behavior and institutional behavior. Not all of that, all of those changes that we undertook of necessity in order to keep our economies running are going to stay in place, but we're not going to revert to where we were before either. We learned some things. We will have expanded use of digital technologies in multiple sectors, including ones that were highly resistant to it, like education and healthcare. But the acceleration was dramatic. Now we're seeing a bit of the aftermath of that. So the markets got excessively enthusiastic about this and assumed the acceleration was a permanent feature of the world, and it isn't. So we're drifting back toward normal. And so you are seeing a pretty violent reset of asset prices in the financial markets, induced in part by recovery from that kind of over-enthusiasm, and then turbocharged by the expectation of rising interest rates. So this is going to feel pretty volatile for the next little while. One of the effects of the pandemic was that it was dramatically bad from the point of distributional, both within countries and across countries. Within countries, the people who either worked in extremely dangerous conditions or had their jobs simply disappear as economies locked down were people who worked in sectors where a rather small number of people relative to the total can work remotely. So this is a picture that's taken from the United States, but the pattern is similar across countries. So if you at the top end, educational services and and professional scientific, finance and so on, pretty much can keep going, at least for a while, on remote working and working from home. And then you get down to the bottom of this list on the left-hand side, and if you look at the hospitality industries, hotels, foods, and restaurants, which are shut down, there basically nobody can work from home, or almost nobody. And that in many economies is a very substantial fraction of total employment. In America, it's 17 million people. And if you look at it internationally, one of the things that I feel badly about is I think the vaccine rollout globally was on the part of the institutional system. So this is just a picture of that, reasonably up to date as of February 22nd. February 2022. And this is just unacceptable. And I hope that if we confront this kind of thing again, that we will have collaborated in building the international institutions and resourcing them in such a way that we don't repeat this performance. On current conditions, I mean, I think that it's very important to say that the supply chain congestion is way more serious than anybody thought even a year ago. It's not transitory. These blockages are extreme, and they are a major approximate source of inflation. Now, central bankers will correctly tell you that the risk of this is twofold. One, rising prices and people struggling to make ends meet. But the other one, of course, is that inflationary expectations get embedded. And once they're embedded, then even if you take away the supply-demand imbalances, which is what we're experiencing now on a global basis, the inflation's still with us, and you have to take fairly extreme measures on the monetary policy side to sort of reset those expectations. So once again, the central banks, and this was described a few moments ago, are walking down a narrow corridor in which they're trying to sort of get inflation under control, and on the one hand, and not produce a sudden stop in the major economies. This is, as was described, is no easy task, and we're not sure what the outcome of it's going to be. In addition, we have dramatically rising inflation. I took this graph from a little while ago. It's out of date now. These numbers, in Europe and America are more in the 6, 7. The United States checked in last month at 8.6. And that was following a prediction that inflation had peaked. There's now a feeling that the Federal Reserve, which is the American Central Bank, may raise rates by 0.75 of a percentage point, which was, unthinkable, even 6 months ago. So we're playing, if we're not playing catch up, we're playing something that's pretty close to it, and we're in tricky territory. One of the effects of this is extreme volatility in the financial markets, and it's not just volatility. I mean, asset prices are resetting in a major way across the major markets. There are longer term impacts of the pandemic. One of the ones that worries me most is what's the long run impact on educational students at various levels who were unable to go to school for an extended period of time. Again, we have people doing research on this, but it's important, and I think an important dimension of policy. If we are, as we should be, focused on the youth and the future, and their inventiveness and education and creativity, we need to sort of ask ourselves the question: what can we do to help override the negative shock that many of these young people have experienced? Let me draw a line under that. Underlying this, and this is just Mike Spence and the way I think about the world, I think we are in the midst of really enormous, longer term kind of secular technology and science driven transformations in the global economy. One of them is just a function of the rise of emerging economies and their increasing economic importance and power. in the global economy. Frequently Asia is mentioned because that's the most populous part of the world, but it's happening everywhere. And it is producing fundamental changes in everything from trade patterns to the architecture of global supply chains to our ability to sort of agree on the rules of the road, the rules of engagement in the global economy. The other three are technological and scientific. There's a huge multidimensional digital transformation underway. And it is going to change work and jobs and supply chains and comparative advantage and create tons of entrepreneurial opportunities, many of which were mentioned before, and I'll talk a bit about them in a minute. There's a biomedical revolution underway. It isn't just biomedical, it's really biology. And it affects everything from healthcare and medicine to drugs and vaccines to agricultural products and so on. And these things are being driven by incredibly powerful tools. I'll mention them in a moment. The third one, which I'm sure you're going to talk about, is a massive energy transition that's required, at least as part of the response to the climate challenge and the challenge of living within the planetary boundaries, the sustainability challenge. And the reason I think we're seeing a dramatic acceleration in these is we have incredibly powerful technologies. I don't have time to mention them all, but I think it's important to understand that this isn't just happening, sort of in a vacuum. We have on the left-hand side at the top a picture of what the global economy looks like and what it will look like by 2030, and you can see the emerging economies are the dominant part of the world when we get there. On the top right, you have the current state of semiconductor technology. So we're within 2 or 3 years at Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Association of having, basically 3 nanometer separation of the transistors on a semiconductor chip. That means that on the semiconductor chip in your iPhone or whatever you use in a couple of years, you'll basically have 291 million transistors in every square millimeter on that chip. This is a supercomputer. There's no question about it. It can do artificial intelligence. It can do things that we couldn't do with a machine that filled a room in the 1990s. It's really quite extraordinary. On the bottom right is this dramatic reduction in the cost of solar, which we hope will become an important part of the energy transition. One of the things I wanted to say about that, because it affects the institutions that are supporting or represented here, the central banks and the international financial institutions and trade institutions, is that solar is a capital intensive technology. And so whether or not this is, a good thing, a substitute for fossil fuel based technologies depends a whole lot on the cost of capital. And the cost of capital is too high in lots of places, and we need active management of risk on an international basis in order to make sure that the costs of capital don't turn out to be, there's funding and the cost of capital associated with this. And again, we're underperforming in this dimension. There's been a $100 billion commitment to emerging economies to help with the energy transition. Best to my knowledge, about 10 billion of that has been delivered so far. Maybe a little bit more, but it's certainly not anywhere near what the objective was when it was agreed on in the climate conversations that occur every year. The one on the lower right is a bit esoteric, but DeepMind in London is owned by Alphabet. It's one of the leading artificial intelligence operations in the world, innovative, creative AI groups. And they did something recently that probably wouldn't cross your field of vision, which is they took the amino acid sequence of proteins and used algorithms to predict their 3-dimensional structure. Now, you might say, who cares? Well, the people who care are biologists because they spent days, weeks, and even months in a lab trying to figure out what the 3-dimensional structure of a protein is, because that's what determines what it binds to, how it behaves, whether it's a medicine or a vaccine. So this is just an enormous productivity booster in the field of biomedical science. And there's lots more that are like that. But the message I wanted to deliver to you is that we have these incredibly powerful technologies that are driving the opportunity set for businesses, for entrepreneurs, for these young creative people who see the opportunities that are being created, regardless of whether they're in scientific research or whether they're doing it in the business world and being financed by venture capitalists. This is the cost of DNA sequencing. It behaved like Moore's law for 10 years or so, and then the cost just dropped like a stone. So we're within shooting distance of having DNA sequencing costs somewhere between $1,000 and $500. It's an absolutely essential tool in the biomedical sciences. One of the things that I am very excited about is the global growth of entrepreneurial activity. I used to live in Silicon Valley, and it wasn't much more than 10 or 15 years ago where you could count on the fingers of one hand the places which were the major sort of supportive ecosystems for the technology-oriented startups. That is a completely different picture now. You have major, entrepreneurial activity and growth companies pretty much in the world. Now, the big markets have a bit of an advantage because of the cost structures, high fixed, high development, low variable costs. So they scale, easily and into larger markets. But here you can see this picture, and here are the African unicorns. This is a very small slice of the important entrepreneurial activity that's occurring in Africa. And a lot of these companies are facilitating the financial infrastructure that is required to go along with the continental free trade aspirations of your institutions. So this is really quite exciting stuff. And I think everything that one can think of to do to make sure that the supportive, one of the reasons this has happened is that the institutions that know how to do this went global, right? Like they decided that they weren't just going to sit in, California or London or now, New Delhi and Shanghai and Hangzhou and whatnot. And they're everywhere. And they know what they're doing. They are company builders. They're not people who just think they're making risky investments. And they're good at it. And so these supportive ecosystems are really important. A lot of these entrepreneurs in these companies that have become very successful in the African context are going to be in the next round, are going to be angel investors. And they know what they're doing, and they'll be wonderful mentors for the next generation of entrepreneurs. And and I don't mean to pick on Africa. I mean, I have friends who watched the development of the entrepreneurial ecosystems in Paris, in France, and that was a key element of it. The early successful entrepreneurs who became relatively wealthy became angel investors and were the core of the building of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that now thrives in that environment. So it's a very exciting set of developments. A lot of it's digital, not all. You can see it in the energy transition, and you can see it in the biomedical sciences. But the big wave, the huge wave, is in the digital area. And a lot of these companies succeed with a business model that is nearly perfectly aligned with economic and social objectives. A lot of them make money and produce value by serving underserved populations who are relatively remote from the range of services that we're used to in major urban centers like Cairo. And so this is just a kind of stunning expansion, not only of the entrepreneurial activity, but in the inclusiveness of the growth patterns. Now, they don't all have that characteristic, but a lot of them do. You can see it in e-commerce. You can definitely see it in the fintech areas, financial services that were basically inaccessible before, but you're seeing it in education and in healthcare as well. There's two young people that I ran into at Stanford, decided you could use image recognition, which is an enormous AI advance to detect skin cancer. And they worked with the dermatologists at the Stanford Medical Center, and it worked. It wasn't a perfect substitute for a great dermatologist, but so you could say, well, that's nice, so kind of as a way to benchmark progress in artificial intelligence, but it's actually more than that. A very large number of our fellow citizens on this planet do not live anywhere near a dermatologist. And that thing in your pocket has a camera, and you can take pictures, or a family member can take pictures of your skin and pick off things that are risky and trigger, uh, uh, you know, uh, taking an 85-kilometer ride to get the potential risk checked by a dermatologist. So once again, you see the use of technology in pursuit of expanding access to critical elements of primary healthcare. So anyway, when I get up in the morning, these are the things I'm really excited about. Let me mention, before I run out of time, key trends in the economy. And this is a little bit more of a downer, because I think we're in a very, very difficult situation. And my summary is a lot of things are going to happen. It's going to be a very bumpy ride. And we're going to have a very difficult next 2 to 3 years in the global economy, for reasons that I think you'll understand. Now, the first one up on the left is aging. That's not, for most of you in the room, your problem. But 75% of the global GDP is produced at this point in aging societies, and the dependency ratios are rising dramatically, and they're rising in the context of at least some reduction in fiscal space. And so there's questions about whether or not the resources are going to be available to invest heavily in these longer term transitions. So let me take the energy transition. The current estimates are that we require on a global basis of about $3.5 trillion per year of incremental investment, roughly half and half, public and private sector. So 1.7 roughly in the public sector globally. Now that 3.5 is not impossible. The global economy is 70 to 80 trillion dollars right now. So in percentage terms, it's a stretch, but it's not ridiculous. But it's not going to be easy to get there in this environment. We have the rising sovereign debt ratios. One of the things we don't understand, but it's becoming increasingly obvious, is we have very large shifts in labor market behavior on the supply side. People are leaving the labor market. People are declining to perform certain jobs. And it's happening all over the place, and it is a major contributor to the supply slash inflationary kind of pressures that we're feeling. You all know we have rising geopolitical tensions, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. We have essentially lived in an environment for at least 3 decades that had major deflationary pressures. It was the bringing into the global economy of massive amounts of essentially unused productive capacity. People, but also investment that went along with them, and the relative price of a lot of manufactured goods simply dropped by a lot, producing deflationary pressures pretty much on a global basis. Those opportunities still exist, but that pressure relative to the size of the global economy is fading. So we have less underutilized capacity than we had before, and we have tens and tens of millions of new middle class consumers who have made the global economy on the demand side absolutely enormous. And so I think we're going to live in a world that feels more supply constrained than before, and we cannot count on the arrival of millions and millions of new people into the kind of productive supply chain part of the global economy to achieve our productivity goals, which means they're going to have to come from somewhere else. I call this the Lewis turning point in the global economy. It comes from Sir W. Arthur Lewis's remarkably insightful assessment of what the kind of growth dynamics look like in a non-resource rich developing country in the early stages. And finally, and I'll spend a minute on this. By now I think everybody understands that Europe is going to diversify away from dependence on Russian fossil fuels. Um, and that's not going to, end even if the Ukraine conflict is settled. There's a firm commitment here that this undiversified dependence is a bad position to be in. This is not an economic argument. It's an economic and energy security argument. But what I'm about to say, and you may not go all the way with me, is this isn't going to stop with energy diversification in Europe. This is going to become a pattern. We are living in a global economy that is subject to increasingly frequent and extreme shocks from climate, from pandemics, from geopolitical tensions, from all kinds of sources. And the response to that is going to be a complete change in the architecture of global supply chains, and it will be driven a little bit, or maybe even more than a little bit, by business decisions, because resilience has value in a kind of high shock environment, but it'll be driven by government policy as well, and you can see that starting to happen everywhere. And with respect to the geopolitical tensions, there will be an element of it that is biased in the direction of what you might call reliable trading partners, whatever that is. and so we're in a whole new world. But the diversification process itself is going to be driven by a set of considerations that have more to do with economic security in various aspects, and not what we're used to. What we're used to is efficiency and comparative advantage and a completely global and open economy. And the problem with that architecture is, frankly, that it won't work in this environment. Works fine if there's no shocks, but you deliver a pandemic-like shock to these systems and nobody knows what's going on. I mean, ask yourself the question, who has the data that describes the global supply chains reasonably completely so you know what the state of the system is and can anticipate problems? And the answer is nobody. This system is decentralized, incredibly complex, and nobody has visibility into the kind of overall state of the system. And so it's myopic, and it kind of bumps into problems when they're already pretty severe. And a lot of companies are going to try to change this now. They're going to flip the supply chains to the customer and have it driven by digital, digital underpinnings infrastructure. And that's all very well, but then we've got to solve this problem of, well, who's going to have the data? Is Under Armour and Nike and Adidas going to share their data? And if the answer is yes, with whom? Because they're competitive issues. So these are all, part of the sort of architectural transition that we're going to experience. It's a period, I guess I would say, by way of an interim summary, of extraordinary, complex, and rapid change. I think there is a real possibility, especially from digital, to have a huge productivity burst. And if you live in a world with as many headwinds as we have, aging populations, supply chain congestion, etc., a huge productivity surge would do an awful lot of good. Sovereign debt overhangs, etc. But it'll be a complicated world. People are going to have to make transitions because of the energy transition and because of digital technologies, and they need help and support in doing that. So this is really a restatement of what I just said. Sorry, I went backwards. But if you have these headwinds and the volatility that we're currently experiencing and want to know, how are we going to get out of this in the sort of medium to longer term? And the answer is staying focused on the opportunity set associated with these potential productivity enhancing activities. I'm almost done. And this is, again, a summary of what I just said when in talking about diversification. But these supply chains, we went into them. They were built for a shockless, or a relatively low shock world. They were tightly wound. completely decentralized, and they stopped working very well as a result of the pandemic. In addition, in the pandemic, on a global basis, most businesses went into survival mode, which meant whatever buffers they had in terms of inventories and stuff for unusual activity were eliminated. And so it was actually less resilient as a result of the onset of the pandemic than it would have been even in more normal times. As I say, nobody's going to put up with this in the indefinite future, but it's but solving these problems is A, not easy, B, involves diversification and increased expense and increased inflationary pressure and so on. And maybe even some movement in the direction of a world that has spheres of influence, meaning clubs of people who regard themselves as reliable trading partners. Now, I have to say, and this is obvious in looking at the response to the Ukraine conflict, a very large part of the world, which I characterize as non-aligned, doesn't want to go down this road. They don't want to be on the American side or the American European side or the Chinese side or anybody else's side. They want to operate in a multilateral environment, taking responsibility for their own development, but with opportunities, in a reasonably open global economy. And I think one of the big challenges is, we can't go back to the old one. It's too simple, right? It's not, it doesn't recognize the tensions. It doesn't recognize that digital regulation, is very, very complicated and won't go the same way in different parts of the world. Data will be required to be, housed, on particular batches of geography. There'll be questions about the mobility of the data, depending on which border it's crossing. Financial sanctions or America's still reserve currency power is being used for sort of extraterritorial restrictions on people. I mean, some of this may recede, but the notion that we can go back to an architecture of the type that we had before, I think, is something most people, simply have given up on. And we're going to have something that works, but is more complicated. And story. So, it's a very, very serious problem, because central banks' credibility depends on not sitting on the sidelines when inflation occurs. And you heard before that, engineering what's usually called a soft landing, which means not crashing the real part of the economy in order to get the inflationary pressures to go away. My view of this, for what it's worth, is we need, inflation is going to run for a while. And one of the reasons it's going to run for a while is that the supply demand imbalances, which are the fundamental underlying cause or trigger, even if there's inflationary expectations coming down the road, aren't going to dissipate very quickly. I mean, it's pretty obvious. All the predictions about transitory in supply chain congestion have turned out to be wrong. So they're sort of similar to the kind of growth forecast. And global growth is now being forecast at barely over 2%. We haven't seen that in a long, long time. And then the war in the Ukraine has turbocharged this. So we now have globally, very, very high energy costs, fossil fuel costs, and agricultural costs, and many of you are wrestling with the consequences of that in terms of its impact on a subset of your citizens. So, and finally, the zero tolerance approach to COVID in China, which some people think is a mistake, and some people think they don't have any choice. But however you come out, it's a major, major source of supply restrictions. It affects ports, it affects manufacturing facility, it affects consumption in the Chinese economy. So my forecast is the Chinese economy, for the first time in a long, long time, will grow at least this year in single digits. Now, its growth potential is still high, as is the growth potential in many of your countries. So it's not as if this is a permanent condition, but it's part of the struggle we need to undertake in the next couple of years. And the final thing I'll just mention is nationalism, right? So we had a kind of commitment, maybe not complete, to a reasonably open global system, but it had, but that commitment is fading. And nationalism and national priorities are more prominent now, and a more important feature of how the global economy functions. And the reason for that is complicated, but one of them is that the previous version of globalization, as Darren Asimoglu says, was delivered a lot of benefits, including a whole lot of potential growth, actual growth in emerging economies, but it had distributional consequences that weren't addressed. And the architecture was basically constructed to favor people who own capital, as opposed to and consumers, as opposed to people who are working, at least in the developed countries. And so we have a kind of backlash. 10 years ago, I wrote a book that was about convergence. Convergence means, the growth of the developing countries and their eventual arrival at sort of high income, high opportunity, status. I still believe that convergence is not only possible, but will probably occur. But the kind of convergence that won't occur is convergence in values and governance structures, and the way the state and the private sector interact in various economies. Though that convergence is not going to occur. It was expected to occur maybe 15 years ago. Those expectations are all gone. And that makes the job of architecting the new global rules of engagement more complicated than they were before. I hope that isn't too gloomy a picture. I'll say a brief word about U.S.-China strategic competition. My view of this is we are going to have both strategic competition and strategic cooperation. We hope we have the strategic cooperation in areas where it's absolutely crucial, like climate change and the pandemics, and maintaining some degree of openness in the global economy. Strategic competition, I think, is just inevitable. You have a rising power. Nobody is going to want to be seriously behind in terms of military, technological, and other capabilities. China's big enough to be a credible alternative to the traditional powers. So the question isn't whether we're going to have strategic competition. It's whether it takes a benign or less benign form. Those of you who are familiar with Schumpeterian competition know perfectly well that there's a benign version of it that produces quite dramatic advances. But the benign version, means you struggle hard to stay ahead in technological terms. But what you don't do is sort of tie your competitors' feet together, by denying them access to markets and other things. And so I think the jury is out right now on whether the strategic competition, which is almost surely going to be with us, between the United States and China, and maybe Europe and others will join in as their policies move them into this territory. But the question is it going to be reasonably benign? So both China and the U.S. and everybody else who's in the competition moves forward, reasonably rapidly, but nobody really seriously believes that they can be dominant for an extended period of time. It's the dominance objective led by national security considerations that leads to the less benign form of strategic competition. So again, we don't know how that's gonna come out. I think it's probably time for me to stop. So I appreciate your attention. I didn't want to soft pedal an assessment of the current situation. I think it's pretty hard, pretty difficult, pretty complex, but underlying it, there are huge opportunities for all of you and for your countries. An open economy on a continent of 1.4 billion people and rising is a huge advantage if you can achieve it. I mean, it will be a dramatic accelerator of innovation and entrepreneurial activity. I mean, you don't have to know a whole lot of economics to understand why that's so important. You have dramatically young, energetic people wanting to play their role in society. I'm pretty optimistic about the future. You know, if people are as committed as they sounded earlier this morning. So thank you for listening to me.
The professor said we're living in a world where these enormous shocks are going to be the norm, a new world. Can we put our hands together for giving us a little insight into that new world? The Nobel laureate and economist, Professor Michael Spence, thank you very much for that. Now, I did mention earlier that there was another deal that was going to be signed in the summit room at 1:50 p.m. In a few minutes. That's the AEE Power deal. It's a Pan-African EPC contractor, AEE Power, and power developer, which specializes in power infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, Afreximbank just concluded a $35 million facility to support AEE Power across Africa through the Afreximbank Guarantee Program, AFGAP, for a period of 4 years. This milestone facility will allow AEE Power to continue to deliver on its commitment to light up Africa. AEE Power has successfully completed EPC contracts, delivering power to Senegal, Angola, Togo, Kenya, Djibouti, Tanzania, and DRC. Now we move on to the first of several panel discussions before lunch. We're going to have one, and then we're going to break for lunch. And this one looks at what it takes to reorder that brave new world, to prepare for that brave new world, to reorder global supply chains, and how we can best harness the power of the African continental free trade area. I'll invite the moderator now to introduce his panel, and he is one of Kenya's leading media practitioners. He's a broadcaster. His name is Charles Odiambo. Please give a warm welcome to Charles.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Mark. And I want to promise you that this is going to take the shortest possible time because I know there's been a lot of concentration on Professor Spence's presentation. And I also want to entice you by telling you that the organizers have gladly accepted to treat you to a very serious lunch at the Marquee after this. And so you will be directed accordingly. Very quickly, because we want to make this short and snappy, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to invite on stage Ambassador Albert Muchanga, the Africa Union Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals. Now, if this was a 4x400-meter race, Ambassador Muchanga would actually be the anchor. Those of you who've been in athletics know exactly what I mean. He is the most dependable person. Ambassador, you're welcome. Thank you very much. I will also wish to invite on stage His Excellency Rami Abdulnaga, the Deputy Governor, Central Bank of Egypt, Arab Republic of Egypt. Thank you so much and welcome. A very hospitable country. Just take the next seat. Allow me to invite on stage Mr. Christian Yoka. Mr. Christian Yoka is the Director of Africa Department at the French Development Agency. A round of applause, Mr. Yoka. And of course, joining us virtually will be Dr. Vera Songwe. Dr. Vera Songwe is the United Nations Under Secretary General and Executive Director at the Economic Commission for Africa. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. And in the interest of time, I will not waste a lot of time. Do we have Dr. Songwe? Do we have Dr. Songwe somewhere? As we wait for Dr. Songwe to join us, I am told we have dropped the link. I am sure the technical team is working on it. Ambassador, like I said, if this was an athletics race, 4x400 meters, you'd actually be the anchor. Now, there's something that President Orama said about Africa will have to solve its own problems. Where are we? you helped in nurturing AFCFTA. What are the threats? What are the opportunities in this re-emerging situation?
Thank you very much, moderator, and I greet each and every one of you. I think in looking at this issue, the first thing you need is to harness the vision of our leaders. It was pointed out on the screen here that as far back as 1963, our leaders had a vision of creating an African common market. And that started almost immediately. Because in the 60s and 70s, we had the establishment of regional economic communities. And in 1991, we had the treaty establishing the African Economic Community, commonly known as the Abuja Treaty. 2012, we had the action plan on boosting intra-African trade, which laid the basis for the establishment of what we then called the Continental Free Trade Area. And the guidelines for negotiating that were agreed upon in 2015. And 2 years was given to negotiate the agreement. And that was finalized in December 2017 and went for signature in March 2018. And within a period of 1 year, 1 month, 1 week, and 1 day, the agreement was ratified, which shows that there was very, very strong political will towards the African economic integration. And behind this, there's also another important document, which is the African Union Agenda 2063, the Africa Want, where the vision is to really create an integrated Africa that has leverage in the global economy. Now, we have a situation where we have these unprecedented problems. We have to harness that. And harnessing that means going towards deeper economic integration. Some experts say we should not be in a hurry. But as indicated, sometimes you have to use unconventional means to create your own future. And through that, the African Continental Free Trade Area can develop regional and continental supply chains and value chains. And already, we've identified sectors like automotive, baby food, clothing, and pharmaceuticals for the development of these regional value chains. And that also comes against the background where some regions like the European Union Community are talking of strategic autonomy so that they do not face similar supply chain constraints in the future. I'll finish quickly. Then countries like Egypt, China and India have talked of deepening national markets. And the US has talked of self-reliance. So the opportunity for Africa and the reality across Africa is that for us to withstand what is going on in the global market, we need to create a single African market as soon as possible. So we need to develop a market which becomes a consumer market and a source of intermediate products. So there's no choice but to deepen economic integration and moving as soon as possible towards an African common market.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. At the moment, after the advent of COVID, about 39 million people in Africa sunk below the poverty line. And before the recovery could be hatched, the Ukraine crisis struck. When I come back, I will be asking you exactly what are we doing practically to actualize all these brilliant ideas? Because Africa is like a 60-year-old man with very fertile land, strong sons and daughters, quite energetic and intelligent, but who have to go and borrow outside or sell their skills outside. And when there are no roads to go and fend in the urban areas, there's a crisis at home. But hold it right there. I want us to pick on Dr. Vera. Dr. Vera, are we there? Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Earlier on, we had a presentation from Professor Spence, and he gave a very interesting quote. He said, we have to rethink things we have never been thinking of or things that we have been taking for granted. That was Dr. Spence. And this reminds me President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni on Labor Day this year told Ugandan citizens that they have to stop crying about wheat and start thinking about cassavas. Dr. Songwe, what are these things that we have to rethink about?
Quais são as coisas que precisamos pensar?
I think we're getting the translation. Sorry, what was your question?
J'entends une connexion, j'entends une connexion.
Dr. Songwe, can you hear us?
Dr. Songwe, Dr. Songwe, vous êtes ouvindo toutes les langues.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, there's a bit of an interruption from the translation room. If somebody could just check on that, the translation room. Dr. Songwe.
I can hear you.
Thank you. Go on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you just go back to the last part of your question? I listened to you said Mr. Spence, Professor Spence said something.
Yeah. Professor Spence earlier on in his presentation told us that we have to rethink things we have been taking for granted. And this reminded me a speech by President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni on Labor Day in Kololo airstrip, where he said Ugandans should stop crying about wheat and start thinking about cassavas. What are these things that we really have to rethink about that we've been taking for granted?
Thank you for your question. Let me start first of all by congratulating Professor Orama and the whole Afreximbank team for a fantastic get together. Of course, the Central Bank of Egypt for also sponsoring the event and for being allowing for this amazing event to happen. I think your question is easy to answer because we heard from Professor Orama at the beginning. I think we had taken a lot for granted, but one of the signature achievements of Afreximbank this year was putting together the African Vaccines Acquisition Task Team and putting together what we call a no-fault compensation clause scheme. And these are things that we had taken for granted, right? 96% of our pharmaceutical products came from outside the continent, and we had kind of taken that for granted. You said 60-year-old man, maybe there's a woman in that conversation. Can you hear me? I think if we start by that, we will be, Afreximbank has been able to demonstrate very clearly this year that, Africa can do things on its own. With the AVAT scheme that they put in place, Africa was able to, as Governor Tariq Ahmed said, raise the resources that it needed to buy its own vaccines. So we took something for granted, but when we finally realized that we no longer needed to take it for granted, we were able to do that. Again, in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, as Commissioner Muchanga has said. But let me just come back again to one thing that Professor Spence spoke about. In the closings of his conversation, he talked about the fact that he had written a book on convergence, but that today what we are seeing is a different kind of breaking up of the supply chain. This for Africa is an advantage, and this is something we had kind of taken for granted. We actually needed to procure everything from outside the continent. Maybe with the near-shoring conversations, maybe with the friend-shoring conversations, maybe with the security-shoring conversations. As Governor Tariq Ahmed said, why is Egypt buying meat from Brazil? You can buy it from Botswana. But for us to do that, we are going to be able to do we must put in place the infrastructure that is needed. 77% of Africa's trade happens by road today. We are not able to finance the kind of road network that we need to actually stand up a conversation that says, in a world that is diverging, in a world where supply chains are coming closer, can Africa get its supply chains from point A to point B with the resources for the resources that it needs? And I think that that's where institutions like Afreximbank are important. If Afreximbank, we just heard Afreximbank signing a deal for AEE power. Road transportation, rail transportation is going to need electricity in the future.
Sorry about
dynamics. The new world is going to be a technology world. Can you hear me?
And Dr. Songwe, probably look at very quickly the possible threats to this reordering of the global supply chain, especially for an African continental free trade area. What are the possible threats from where you sit?
You know, I think first of all, I see benefits. I see benefits because as we reorder the global supply chain, what Africa can do is actually fast track the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. By reordering the global supply chains, it means that Africa needs to procure more from Africa. It means that institutions like the one that the Afreximbank has set up, the PAPs, the payment scheme systems, will be able to then serve Africa more. It means that maybe we build our infrastructure better. Maybe the road from Lagos to Abidjan gets built faster. Maybe the Central African Highway gets built faster. So for me, I think that these are not threats. These are job creation opportunities. These are innovation opportunities. And Africa must see them as such. I think the next issue will be, and this is where the threats are, the threats will come from the policy environment. If we do not have a policy environment that allows for then, once the roads are built, for the customs borders to be more, to be less friction, to have less friction, then we will have threats. So our biggest threat, I think, is not going to come from onshoring. It's going to come from, do we have the right policy environment to allow goods to move within 1 day or 2 days from Nigeria to Abidjan as they're moving from Africa to China or China to Africa and the other way around. So huge opportunities for job creation, for innovation. We saw from Professor Spence the kinds of unicorns that we can create from the digital technology side. We can begin to store our own data. We can create a whole AI economy on the continent because we can start onshoring and reshoring our data. So I think that what Afreximbank is proposing to us, what the African development agencies are proposing to us, is really that we see these as opportunities. Governor Tariq Ahmed said we need to fund more these institutions so that they can do more, they can do better, they can do faster. That is the conversation we should be having, is how can we put the resources behind these institutions so they deliver on the AFCFTA, which is our Marshall Plan, sooner rather than later.
Dr. Songwe, thank you very much for joining us. I am informed that you have previously arranged engagement and you have to log off. It was our pleasure having you. Thank you very much.
I am here and I can stay. That's fine.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Turning to you, Deputy Governor, His Excellency Ram Abdunaga. Now, what exactly would central banks practically have to do to help the free trade area exploit the opportunities that are available in this reordering journey?
Thank you, Charles, for that question. The central banks have a lot to do, to be honest, and they're going to be inundated with so much work that they wouldn't have probably have to even worry about before the pandemic and before the geopolitical tension. So central banks have to start with bringing macroeconomic stabilization to the picture. You cannot start to fix things or try to even dream of having a more comprehensive economic approach if you don't have the right foundation. So setting the right policies, bringing macroeconomic stability, the right monetary and fiscal policies, of course, at a broader level, have to be instilled before you can really start to take any steps towards what needs to be done. And then you need to be a lot more agile and flexible to address these issues. You cannot just think in a typical conventional way about theories and practices that are that are no longer market sensitive. We've seen how Professor Spence has been providing a very insightful encounter of how things have changed, how the landscape is changing, and how he thinks that the next 2 years and beyond are going to be very challenging. So we have to make sure that we are apt and able to deal with that. Of course, in Africa, we have even more challenges given that we are at a stage where we are trying to emerge strong and bring the right equitable, inclusive policies to our continent, which puts an additional layer of complexity. To that effect, I think there has to be a lot of consideration to what central banks can best deliver in terms of policy that is really commensurate to the size of the challenge that is present and inherent in such conditions. Central banks have to be very agile, as mentioned. They have to look at how there is pockets of values that can create and contribute to the economy when the challenges manifest themselves in very unconventional ways. So you have to look at your toolkit, your conventional toolkit, and beyond that. Beyond that, meaning that you can obviously embark on initiatives such as the ones that we as the central bank have embarked on to really inject liquidity into the veins and arteries of the economy at times where orthodox policies would probably tell you to step out and wear a very straight jacket and not be responsive to the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is exposing itself. You have to be very forthcoming. You have to be in a position not to be deaf to the changes. You have to look at how you can use the tools. You have an opportunity now that I think was very nicely summarized by Professor Spence, how the digital weapons have helped us really take an important and a really massive stride in how you have been able to bring around a lot of economic advancement in different areas. So in the past, we had problems with connectivity. We had problems with distribution channels. You had problems of isolation that were very impertinent because the infrastructure was not there. With the pandemic, this has really given you the opportunity to really press forward and cut years and years of really lack of interest in this field, because no one would have ever even dreaded thinking of education, as Professor Spence has mentioned, being really submissive to technology. So you have to use the toolkits. You use the new tools that are available, digital platforms. You have to look at how payments are really progressing and advancing to serve the underserved society. You have to think financial inclusion at large. When you have economies that are really quenching for financial services, but are being deprived from being able to have access to these services because of lack of connectivity, lack of mobility, you bridge that gap using technology that is really made available and being bolstered by this environment. So as a central bank, you cannot afford to sit back and hope for things to get better. You have to make things get better. And this is really the challenge that central banks are having to grapple with. And of course, you have to also integrate with other stakeholders to onboard, because at this time, as mentioned earlier, these are very choppy economic environments. There's a lot of dispersion, there's a lot of fragmentation. It's not easy to consolidate and to align policies. So you want to make sure that you are able to consolidate and to onboard the stakeholders to have one vision that you can work towards. There's so much more that can be said, but I think these are the main themes when it comes to what central banks need to do. Thank you.
I am glad you appreciate the fact that it's not a straight jacket. Thank you very much, Deputy Governor. We will be looking at how best can we just make sure we have an almost level playing field, even if it's not level across the continent. But before we get to that, Mr. Christian Nyoka, thank you very much for joining us once again. We know the world is deglobalizing now. Everybody is beginning to look inwards, courtesy of the two major catastrophes that we had. First COVID and now the Ukraine crisis. As a major partner in the development of Africa, what exactly is the agency doing towards helping in the reordering the supply chain?
First of all, let me say how happy I am to be here and to join the conversation. And I would like to thank Dr. Rama for inviting me. We value very much the FCFTA project at AFD. We cannot think of a more transformative agenda for Africa. And of course, it's easy for us to say that because when you think about it, Europe has been able to build peace and economic growth in the long term thanks to the common market. So we do believe that this endeavor is really a game changer. And one thing that the pandemic has also taught us is that countries that have a very sizable market or region that are well integrated have resisted best to this crisis. Egypt is actually one example of that. And if you look at Eastern Africa as well, the resilience was better than in some other region within the continent. So we are very supportive of the FCFTA, and we do that in three directions. First, by working at the continental level. We are indeed supporting the AU, the agenda, and I'm glad to share the panel with Dr. here. And we do that by bringing support to, first, the draft agreement or applicable to the rule of origins. That is something, the first item that we've been working on. The second one is the competition rule that will apply. Those documents are now available, and it's up to countries to start negotiating around those documents. And we think that this is very structural and very important if you want to talk about a continental free trade zone. The other support we are bringing to the AU's agenda is the one in relation with digitalization. We have financed and support the program targeting the digitalization of African economies. With this respect, we've been working on e-trade, e-tax, e-services for postal financial services. Those are the actions that we are conducting with the AU, and we will keep on working on that on the second phase, addressing issues such as blue economy and support to SMEs. That's the work we are doing with AU. The second major axis that we are working on is to tackle and to help tackle the connectivity infrastructures. There's no way you can discuss about integrating market if you don't address those infrastructure bottlenecks. And by that I mean, first of all, energy. You have no transformation without energy. Transport and digitalization. And with regard to transport, what we are trying to do and to work on is really to help connect production areas with markets. And actually, this is something we are doing here in Egypt, working on a railway project that help bringing goods from the Delta region to Alexandria and Cairo. And this is very instrumental because without this kind of infrastructure, without that connection, you can develop production, but if you are not able to bring goods to the market, then it's as if you had done nothing. So this is key for us. The other aspect we are working on is really to work on corridors. For instance, Djibouti-Ethiopia corridors we're working on to really facilitate the value chain within this region. One point that I would like to underline regarding infrastructure is that sometimes we tend to really focus on hard infrastructure. This is something that can be sometimes misleading because, of course, hard infrastructures are important, but there's no way you will have efficient market, you will have trade transfer if you don't address the soft part of this infrastructure, namely working on trade facilitation, custom, harmonization, standards. If this part is not addressed, then you won't be able to have effective markets. This is something very crucial, and the good thing with the way the EU has handled this approach today is that the negotiations is done not only on tariffs, but also on services at the same time, which is a very good thing, a good changer. Last point that we are working on, of course, is to support the private sector. If you're talking about continental infrastructure, you need to work with the actual actors of this market, which are the private sector. So with this respect, we bring financing to SMEs, working with the local banking system, and you know that we have a subsidiary called Proparco, who's really bringing financing to the private sector. But when you talk about SMEs, the issue you need to address is not only financing, it's also about bringing capacity to those SMEs. And again, I'm sorry, I'm taking an example from Egypt, but just because my feet are here.
Yeah,
today.
you only use good examples, you know.
We are working with Mesmeda, for instance, into bringing support to SMEs to help them bringing their marketing strategies in order for them to be able to conquer some other markets. Another key point, key segment we are trying to address is that when you talk about transformation of economy, of course, the very first sector you are thinking about is agriculture. You need to work on value chain and help, including small farmers, to really be strengthened and be able to indeed export more and add value to their activities. And that this is a program that we are doing with our partners, some other public banks here in Egypt, NBE, Bank Mist, Banque du Caire. We have a financing agreement with those three entities to tackle this issue and bring support to small farmers on the digital point of view, but not only. And this is, of course, key for us because it's linked financing and SDGs objectives.
Thank you.
And last but not least, all that, we do it with our partner Afreximbank. We have some financing together to really address this trade issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christian Yoka. Finally, Ambassador Muchanga had promised to come back to you. A lot of goodwill from development partners. Afreximbank is virtually bending backwards, almost breaking their backs to support and to provide mitigation measures. Now, somebody once said, if we treat the circumstances we are in normally, the circumstances will treat the world abnormally. When do we see the practical, complete actualization of the AFCFTA? Because it looks like this is the Midas touch. This is the magic wand.
Thank you very much. The African Continental Free Trade Area is currently Africa's biggest development program.
Can you hear him?
Let me use that. The African Continental Free Trade Area is currently Africa's biggest development program. And if it has to work, it's a do-it-yourself affair. It is us as Africans to make it work. Nobody is going to do it. And we have to come up with the unconventional ways and means of doing that. One of the major key elements is to connect the African continent physically. And that requires infrastructure spending. The African Development Bank has told us that each given year, there is upwards of $170 billion deficit in infrastructure spending. The next issue is financial integration. And here we have two success stories. The first one is that working with the African Export-Import Bank and the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area, There is now what is called the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. And it was highlighted in the statement by the chairman and the president of the board of directors of the African Exporting Board. Another aspect of financial integration is to create a Pan-African stock exchange. In July this year, about a month from now, I'm going to sign a memorandum of understanding with the African Association of Stock Exchanges to start the groundwork for the establishment of the African Stock Exchange. Then there are several other opportunities for domestic resource mobilization. We are working with the African Tax Forum to enhance domestic resource mobilization by the revenue agencies across Africa. And in addition to that, we're also working with them and the Mbek Foundation to see if we can enhance the fight against illicit financial flows, which annually are in the about $90 billion US, which goes out of Africa. If that was spent domestically, then it was returned domestically, then it would go towards really enhancing domestic resource mobilization. The African diaspora, they've come forward to say, if we enabled them to set up an African diaspora finance corporation, they would be able to mobilize about 150 billion US. Then the final point is when you look at the pension funds, the mutual funds, and the sovereign wealth funds across Africa. And from here, I'll be going to Morocco to attend that meeting. One of the issues that they are complaining about is that there are very few African countries that are investment ready. If they had a minimum of 20 African countries that are investment ready by way of very stable rules and regulations and policies to attract investments, they would be able to invest their resources inside Africa. And we're addressing that issue. So the opportunities are there, and all we need is to really work closely among ourselves as the African stakeholders to say, let us mobilize our resources, our capabilities to make the African continental free trade area. The power lies with us. Thank you.
It's very sad. Very sad, ladies and gentlemen, that you are hungry. Somebody is willing to offer you food, but he says you don't have the plate where they will serve the food. That African countries are not fully investment ready. That's a challenge to each and every one of us here. And I will finish with the statement I started with from Professor Orama. Africa's problems are for Africans to solve. It lies squarely in your hands. This conversation will be continuing over lunch. Remember, this is just the first of the 3 days that we'll be having to talk about solutions to our own problems. I challenge each and every one of you who is already converted to this course to try and convert another soul so that we walk this together. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. A round of applause to my panelists. And Mark, take it away, please.
And thank you very much, Charles Odiamba, for that spirited handling of our first panel. As Charles said, we're going to have another plenary session when we come back from lunch. That's on the implications of the Ukrainian crisis for African economies and trade. So anyway, it's time to move from nourishing the brain to nourishing the belly. Lunch is now served. Golf buggies will take the delegates to the big marquee tent, which is just outside the St. Regis Hotel. So as you go out, they'll take you along there for lunch. For the VIPs amongst you, lunch is served inside the hotel. Now please be back in this room to continue at 3 p.m. I'll see you at lunch.